The most important part in fighting is when a fighter weighs in at the contracted agreement. Fighters would generally cut a lot of weight to try and gain a certain advantage. We see this happen in almost any given UFC fight, especially with a lot of competition in certain weight classes for the UFC. What determines a weight class better than the other? It's mainly the competition that can stack throughout the weight classes individually. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the best UFC weight classes in 2026. But before I get into it, if you guys can, please hit the subscribe button as I am super close to 2,000 subs. And also, let's try to get 25 likes on this video. I have been uploading throughout 2026 with better quality videos. Anyways, let's get into it. Getting into the honorable mentions about two UFC weight classes that didn't make it to the top 3 cut. The UFC middleweight is the first honorable mention on this list. Some of you may be wondering why it hasn't made the cut, or even being mentioned in general. And to be fair, the UFC middleweight has been improving overall with the fighters, and they are to each other in competition. With Khamzat Chimaev being the most dominant fighter in the UFC and currently having the middleweight championship, a fighter won't be able to take a belt off of him for a very long time. But contenders in this weight class, especially from 1 through 7, is stacked and competitive with all of each other. And it includes names such as DDP, Nasruddin Imavov, Sean Strickland, Anthony Hernandez, Brendan Allen, Israel Adesanya, and Caio Brahaio. A lot of these fighters within each other are closer in skill and makes the weight class have more depth. The thing that's missing it to make it into the top 3 is the fact that other weight classes have more competitive contenders in the weight class, but also offers more of a threat than this current 185 weight class, such as our other honorable mention, the UFC featherweights. Now, with the champion of being Alexander Volkanovski at 145 and getting that win recently over Lopez, there are still many great contenders in that weight class, and also a mix of up-and-coming contenders to really give more of a threat to this whole weight class. And honestly, I would say about the top 8 in that weight class are all pretty competitive near each other, especially at a higher skill than the UFC middleweights. You have very high-level contenders at 145 with Imazvar Evliov and Diego Lopez, especially with their skill sets being at a high level overall within the sport. Then you get to the Lerone Murphys, Yair Rodriguez, Aljamain Sterling. Within that category, they're really just one win away to putting themselves in that conversation. And also, not to mention the up-and-coming contenders like Gene Silva and Yusuf Zalal. Yeah, it gets very scary when those two are also mentioned within this aspect. And I feel like within the names I just mentioned, more of them could really compete for that belt sometime sooner than what people think. And also, the rankings in that division just make more sense than I think at 185, even with their skill sets too. Like if I were to compare Sean Strickland and Brendan Allen to being the top 5 to this top 5, it kind of just separates it from what featherweight is to middleweight within those two honorable mentions. This leads me to number 3, which is the lightweight division. Now, I must say that 145 division could interchange to be that number 3 spot of where 155 is currently at. However, it's more limited than 145 depending on what you value more. Now, the champ at 155, Ilia Topuria, don't need to explain much out of him. Now, the interim holder in Justin Gaethje is, yes, for sure a little questionable. If you kind of go down the list with Arman Sharukian, Max Holloway, Charles is still pretty good from where he's at. He just got a recent win back in October. BSD's on the come up. Paddy Pimblett, I know he did lose his fight against Gaethje, but I still think he can give people problems depending on who he fights. And I mean, Gamrot Rufi is still in the 155 division. But I think talents like Max Holloway, Arman Sharukin, Ilia Topuria are just a few that kind of carry that 155 division over 145 in my personal opinion. Now, I think if one of them were to leave that 155 division, it kind of gets a bit scary from there. But because those fighters are just at very high levels of the sport, it's very tricky to kind of interchange 145, 155 in my opinion. But now we kind of get into a tricky part because the next two weight classes that I mentioned are the toughest ones to really rank because they're both really, really good. So I would love to hear what you guys think about these two. Now, what claims the number 2 spot is the 135 weight class. And honestly, a lot of the reasons are very similar to the number 1 spot. If you look from top to bottom of the contender rankings, they're very stacked. At 135, you've had plenty of champions who are at a high level within the sport. You look at Aljamain Sterling, Sean O'Malley, Rob Dvalishvili, and now Peter Yan once again is currently holding the belt. And with some of the names just mentioned that are still in that weight class, they still kind of compete for that potentially being a contender for that 135 belt at some point. Maybe with a question mark sometimes, but besides the point, you also have other names like Umar Nurmagomedov, Corey Sandhagen. Song Yudong is right there as kind of like that gatekeeper who, if you beat him once, you are one more fight away for potentially fighting a belt. And also some up-and-comers too that are coming into that 135 division, like Ayman Zabazi. I hope I pronounced your name right. Mario Batista, Peyton Talbot, David Martinez. It kind of gives that all-around structure of these fighters that could really interchange this whole weight class. And while watching them fight, they're all at a pretty good to a high level of skill to really compete against each other. Yeah, I don't want to forget this one fighter who's still at 135, and although he did lose recently, Davidson Figueiredo can still be a problem within that weight class. A lot of those names that are in the rankings really make this weight class such a competitive and personally one of the best weight classes to see over time. I think back in 2020, there was such a problem with 135 and how very limited it can be. And we're in 2026 with so many different options that could potentially go for a belt soon within the next few years. There's also a lot of changes too. It's not like one person is a champion for a long time. There isn't really a long reign with it, which kind of makes it very special. But yeah, 135 really gets a spot, in my opinion, at number 2 because, again, it's just all around the rankings of that weight class. It's just great. And what's very similar to that at the number 1 spot, to be honest, is 170. Now, before I kind of made these more in-depth videos, still trying to work on my craft, I've always kind of mentioned to peers that the 170 weight class is pretty good, especially at the time when people were saying that 155 is still the best. And I'm glad that my opinion has held very well because this 170 weight class, I'm telling y'all, is no joke. The champion currently, everyone knows, pound for pound number 1, Islam Makhachev. Don't need to explain how great Islam Makhachev is. Him going up from 155, 170 is nuts and was able to defeat JDM 5 rounds. Not even a question. JDM, however, is still very legit. Although he lost against an arguable all-time great, he could still beat a lot of these contenders that are coming up as well. Yeah, I mean, look what he did when he got the belt against Bilal Muhammad. And you have a lot of the names that have been in the running for the 170 weight class as potential rising stars that are now getting their shine. You get Ian Gary, you get Michael Morales, Shavkat is there, but I think they just recently took off Shavkat off the rankings. Carlos Prates making a big name for himself at 170, especially with this recent win. Bilal Muhammad is still in the top 5, and people kind of clown him. But if I'm going to be honest with you guys, Bilal Muhammad is still a pretty solid contender to have at that 170 weight class. He could beat up on some good names within 170, but I feel like when there are contenders that are more talented than him, I think that's where the problem kind of gets. Then we kind of get to that Kamaru Usman, Sean Brady, Joaquin Buckley type of contender tier that, although a little bit of a rough situation that they're at, they're still pretty solid fighters at 170 in that weight class for the UFC. I think with that right there, we're about 10 fighters in, and they just added MVP into the top 15. And let's not get anything misconstrued about MVP. MVP is still a very legit fighter who had to make Ian Gary go and wrestle him. That's how much of his striking really affected Ian Gary to where he turned into a wrestler. Even his win over, the Bullet, the Jared Cannonier win. Listen, MVP going back down to 170, being the contenders once again, is still someone who could kind of give people problems at 170 still. And yeah, if you kind of mix everything together with all the up-and-coming contenders who are rising stars, who've been labeled rising stars for years, that are now finally making their mark in that weight class, really gives that 170 reputation at a very peak level of the sport. And like I said, the depth in this weight class is like no other in this sport. And to kind of wrap it up, these are the best weight classes in 2026 for the UFC. There's a lot of opinions that you can kind of go about within this. And although there could be very minuscule stuff that leads one weight class to be over another, however, I think some of the talent that we see at some of the weight classes are just impressive at the end of the day. But yeah, if you guys like this video and want more, please hit the like, comment, and subscribe button. It would really mean a lot. Let's try getting that 25 likes and the 2,000 subs. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.